Well, can anybody just give me a general rundown on how things move forward in the book of Joshua? We know that there are battles that are fought. How are things generally worked out in a positive way? Is that your hand up? Or you just... I know that hand. I know that usually means that's where it's going to be. Go ahead. You don't have to go to Genesis or anything like that. Just start out with their first battle. How's that?
First battle was battle that
Starts with a J.
Jericho.
Yeah, there you go.
Yes.
You're doing all right. Go ahead.
So yeah, basically they won their first battle. The nation of Israel, being led by Joshua, got at the command of it all. And then, based on last week's class, they, it seemed like they kind of maybe got a little bit full of themselves. And
Okay.
then you had the sin with Achan.
So that's the next battle, and that's with Ai. We'll just... the thing that's interesting, at least to me, there's a lot of things that fascinate me by the way a historian would write out something like this, obviously inspired. But generally, what we have an account of are these battles. That's what they're all about, battles. And I think based on the way things went in Jericho, they had some rather detailed directions on what they were supposed to do, and they just went ahead and they took care of that, and everything was dandy, And then the town was virtually destroyed, with a few exceptions, with the family that were the ones who took care of them and took care of their spies. Right. So I suppose what you'd expect then, now as you move through the book, is okay, they obey God, and then they go in and they fight and they win and they give glory to God, and then that's the way it works. Which is the way it should work, but it doesn't always work that way. I mean, there are some unusual situations. We're going to notice this in the story of the Gibeonites and what they did with them. And I think when we look at that account of Achan, I think we discussed the fact that we should be learning something from that. So who's got some ideas on that? What should we learn on that? Go ahead, Vance. Okay. All right, so I think that comes through, doesn't it? Certainly with Jericho. And then, of course, when they lost the battle, the next battle, then what was the cause of that? Go ahead, Micah.
Just the heart of the people wasn't right. You had Achan because
Okay.
I think it was referenced like it wasn't just him, but the responsibility fell upon the whole nation.
Right.
So just overall as a whole, they
Right.
were, they had to get right.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I tried to make that point a couple of weeks ago, and that was, even though it was Achan and his family, it seems to be pretty much them. They're the ones who decided what? You don't have to get into great specifics, but they decided they'd take some stuff. And they weren't supposed to do that. Now, it doesn't exactly tell you why. Does anyone have any idea about that? About why God didn't want them to do that? So it's kind of open. Go ahead, Christina.
I mean, logically, you don't want to keep the stuff of all these idolaters, because I'm assuming a lot of it would be idols. And God is trying to prove to them, hey, I will take care of you. You don't need the stuff.
Right. Okay, that's a good point. The idea that the reason we're going to do the things we're doing, it's a very spiritual reason. It's that we're trying to create an environment for you guys to be faithful. But here they are, the first time they they have the opportunity. They decide they're going to take things. And it just seemed like a logical thing for them to do that. Just a second, Micah. And so I think that it's important for us to think, well, maybe what kind of lesson did God want them to learn? And Micah made the point about 2 or 3 times in the chapter, it doesn't point out, just as I was saying earlier, Achan and his family did it. It says Israel sinned. And I know if I would have been there, I would have been saying, well, wait a minute, I was minding my own business. And I'm sure there were people who did that. Go ahead, Micah, shortly, and then go ahead, Dana, after Micah.
Maybe just the overall theme is because God is to be accepted as holy and his word is to be accepted as holy, that unless he's commanding it, he's not sanctifying and blessing it. So
Okay.
when perhaps Achan had done what he did, he went outside of what God had commanded and did his own way. And maybe
Right.
that was a lesson to take away that they were
Yeah.
to carry into going into.
Okay, so one of the things that we're going to learn tonight is that it wasn't that way all the time. They didn't always have to not take things. And, I think for me, the big deal that was made out of Achan, and rightly so, and then I'm thinking, well, how did that happen, to where, they were allowed to take some things. Go ahead, Dan.
I think the lesson is don't think you're going to fool God.
Okay.
Nobody else knows except Achan, maybe his
Right.
family, I don't know. But, God knows, and you'll
Right.
find out.
It is a great lesson, is to understand that when we do things, the natural thing is to think that we probably can get away with it if a human being doesn't see us do it. And I don't think anybody actually saw these people do anything, but it became quite aware to others afterward when, as they went through this whole rigmarole of going through the tribes and then finally pointing out that it's Achan and his family, and then those individuals then all suffer. And so it's in that situation where the decree is rather strong. And then certain other things happen as I'm trying to sort of fish this out there, throw it in the water, the idea that it doesn't always work out that way. Go ahead, Jessica.
This is also the first instance where this new generation, the generation that had been allowed to go into Israel,
Right.
had disobeyed God. And he was basically establishing, no, we're not going to do what your fathers did. You are going to obey. It's a lesson in
Yeah.
obedience. It doesn't, and then he said Israel has sinned. It's like, even if they didn't see him take it or join in it, their hearts may not, deep in their hearts, they might have been like, why couldn't we take anything?
Yeah.
And then, well, he took something. It was just the idea. And God had to nip that in the bud and just say, I am serious. You have to obey me.
Right.
Trust me.
Yeah, that's certainly a lesson that comes out of the AI thing. Okay, Micah, I'll give you
Maybe it's
30
something
seconds.
like we're supposed to be our brother's keeper, so we're supposed to hold each other accountable, maybe to some
Yeah.
degree. We make the choice in the end, but maybe there's a lesson in that.
Yeah, because I guess to us, it doesn't sound right, to say, well, all of you guys are responsible. And because it seems like nobody knows. And we tried to point out that we need to look at the congregation that way, that we tend to look at ourselves in a somewhat isolate sort of way, and we're all doing our little individual things. And so, we really don't have that much effect on one another. So it's important for us to understand that we do have a responsibility toward one another. And maybe if other people would have been paying a little bit more attention to what was going on with Achan, then maybe that wouldn't have happened. Yeah, go ahead, Roland. Nolan.
This also shows that with God, there was no gray area. When he commanded something,
Yeah,
he expected it to be done to the letter.
right.
And this goes even in thinking back to the situation with Saul, where he told him to destroy those enemies completely. And
Right. Yeah.
he suffered the consequences.
Yeah, and sometimes, but again, I think we get into this routine of thinking, okay, everybody's supposed to get killed. And it was in certain situations they were. It wasn't in every situation. If God says that's what he wants, well, then that's what should be done. But there are situations where you would kind of think, I mean, my response to what I was reading was that, hey, how come these guys seem to be getting away with something? And, that's up to God to decide what it is he wants in a given situation. He doesn't have to be consistent. He's God. So I always have to figure that there's a reason why he showed, I guess, a certain amount of easiness on those individuals. Good, Dana?
Maybe that's the lesson.
Yeah, well, I hope it's one, yeah.
You have to know what God wants in certain circumstances, and you have to do that.
Yeah.
And different circumstances require different responses.
Sure, so it means we really need to be listening in whatever the circumstances are. I think that's a good point. Go ahead, Ian. Right.
Immediately they start sinning.
Right.
Well, God says, you want to sin? This is what's going to happen. I have to discipline you.
Sure, there were certainly lessons to be learned, weren't there?
Very mildly, you have to be disciplined.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the same thing happens here, and it even says it in the text in 13. It says you have to ritually consecrate yourself because you are contaminated. Sin has infiltrated
Yeah.
his son, so to speak, Israel.
Yeah.
I can't be around you. I can't deal with you. You have to consecrate yourself, and I'm going to remove that sin.
Yeah. It's almost like that. You guys have made us to be impure. Now we need to restart the situation as it is to.
The whole idea that this is a holy God. You don't get to play
Right.
games. You don't get to compromise. You're either all in or I'm not going to be with you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because we too often want to bring God down to our level and think he should think like I do, and we're not helping ourselves in any way. Go ahead.
I think of how he had to feel because Joshua told him, give glory unto God, and he admitted what he did. But even after that,
Yeah.
he did what was promised. What happened?
Yeah, well, he was punished for it in that situation. And I sometimes, I pointed out to you that maybe in one way you would look at it from the perspective of, again, this is one of those things that's happening at the beginning of their taking the land. And so God wants them to hold to his guidance, his commandments. And so he sets an example of Achan. Now, it may not be for that reason. It doesn't tell me that, but I think it's a reasonable inference to draw. Okay, so let's look now at chapter 8. And I was thinking there's a lot of battles here in the book of Joshua. There are in Judges, but there's, all the way up through certainly Solomon, the kings were pretty much involved in some sort of warfare. And then there were other times after that when the kingdom divided and all that. It just seemed like one or the other was in battle. And for the most part, after the days of Solomon, both groups, the northern and southern kingdoms, were individuals that just weren't being faithful enough to God. What had happened was they had already determined in their own lives how they were going to live. And so God says, okay, I told you if you would be faithful, I would protect you, but you chose not to be that way. And so that's when the captivity comes about. Okay, so chapter 8, I think is maybe a bit of a help in looking about the way, how's it supposed to be done. And that's the conquest of Ai. And we looked at this. Remember what happened after Jericho? They were very obedient to God. And then something happens. And in verse 1 it says of chapter 8, the conquest of Ai, the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear or be dismayed. Take all the people of war with you. Arise and go to Ai and say, I have handed over to you the king of Ai, his people." Now, when he faced him before, what was their attitude? How did they approach this when they went into battle? What were some things that were missing? A couple of things there at the beginning. Well, what was always a good idea? It was always a good idea to make sure that God was on your side. Okay, so yeah, God says, this is what I want you to do. Before they'd given little or no consideration. Go ahead, Micah. I already did it? Okay. So, anyway, they get their act together. We've already talked about that. And so I think that's important. And it was a correction that they needed to make. We need to understand that God is who's got us here. And I think that's also another important point, like what Ian was talking about. All through the wilderness wanderings, it's God who's taking care of them. But now we're going to get into a place where we are going to be, somewhat of a power source. And so they kind of stopped remembering God. And so that's what got them in trouble. And so again, there's that principle that I think is so important, because again, you get into these the chapters. These chapters, or the earlier ones, are a little bit more story-like, and then they get into and so defeated so-and-so, who defeated so-and-so, who defeated so-and-so. So we're going to go through some of those rather quickly. But in verses 3 to 9 of chapter 8, they actually planned the tactics according to God and what God wanted. The battle ensued, and then notice in verse 24 to 29 of chapter 8, because this is where it may surprise you a little bit after what happened with Jericho, and also then what happened with Ai. It says, when Israel had finished killing all the inhabitants of Ai in the field, in the wilderness where they pursued them, and all of them had fallen by the edge of the sword until they were destroyed, then all Israel returned to Ai and struck it with the edge of the sword. So it sounds pretty much like we're used to in the way God was working at that time. And of course, when we look at the way things are now in that particular region, well, there's a lot of anger, and there's a lot of distrust of the people around you. It's not a whole lot different. Of course, we must understand that these individuals are coming to this kingdom, this land, this place of promise, not because it's their land, but it's because that's where God was going to function the coming of the Christ. He's going to come through them in that land. Now, so, what happens today, I hate to see it, and most of you, I know if you're following this, it's just an awful thing to think about, what's gone on over there with the Palestinians and in the place they call Israel still. They fulfilled their role as God's people. And even though, they have just as much right as anybody to land, if they conquer, then they have the right to have the land. That's just the way the world works. But they don't have it, and they shouldn't be thought of as having it because God wants them to have it. Now, I know that that's what many of them think, but of course, they're also the same people, for the most part, in their history, who rejected Jesus. So it's very important for us to remember that. And I don't wish any bad stuff on those people, because you just try to put yourself in their place, and it would just be almost impossible to imagine something like that and being involved in it. So it's very, very significant here that what happens as I read and follow. It says in verse 46, Joshua, I'm still in chapter 8, did not withdraw his hand with which he reached out with the sword until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. So there's God's involvement that's seen there in the support of Joshua. Now he says, Israel took only the cattle and the spoils of that city as plunder for themselves in accordance with the word of the Lord, which he had commanded Joshua. Now what should tip us off as to why this is not a problem? Yeah, God said you can take certain stuff. And again, when you get into a habit of reading things, and I know my brain's a little different than others, but I get into sort of a rhythm when I'm studying something. And when I see a pattern that develops, then I want to see that fulfilled again. And so when you get to that, when you've kind of made up your mind, this is the way it works. God will help you win the battle. Don't take anything. But that's not the way it worked in this situation, see? But it was because God said this will be okay for you to do that. And I guess, would that cause them to kind of be on their toes whenever they were getting ready to take on a particular area?
Especially after he gives such exact instructions about how to do the ambush and Benjamin,
Right.
the gully and all of that. And it turns out good. Then you would think that the next time they would really consult God with, okay, but what are the details?
Sure. Right.
Do we have to go this far east? Do we have to go?
Sure. Well, they should have. I mean, whether it seems like minutia or not, the point is they should be ready to understand that through Joshua they were going to be doing what God wanted them to do, and they should be very, very aware of that. Go ahead, Micah.
Maybe the lesson in it is because God didn't, when they conquered Jericho, he wanted to annihilate it completely because he understood their hearts and minds.
Yeah.
Like us, we can get distracted by things, and so maybe he wanted to make sure that they were focused on his word and his
Sure.
command, that they would be responsible enough, like, hey, if you are if I'm giving this to you, I can trust you because of what you've gone through, what you've experienced as a
Yeah.
people, that you'll be responsible for what I do.
Yeah, there's a reason of what I call of depth. It's not just a matter of, well, God wanted to sort of throw in a few laws here or there, and he wanted to try to trick them, And God doesn't want to do that. He's not interested in tripping you up. But the point is, let's pay attention. God said we should take stuff when we win this battle. And when you think about sometimes, well, what's there to learn here? When you're going through a lot of the violence that's there, well, there's a lot to be learned there. Amid the bloodshed. And to realize that what God is doing here, he is giving these people a land so through them, the Messiah can come and be a part of this particular land. He could come from that group of people, and specifically from the tribe of Judah. That's why. Okay. Any questions?
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
So at AI, he tells them, don't take it.
No.
Or Jericho.
Yeah.
He tells them, don't take it.
Yeah.
And then he allows them to take stuff.
When at the next battle.
The next,
After they had lost that battle too, the first one.
there doesn't seem to be a reason like why don't take stuff here, why it's okay.
Sure.
Is God just like testing them?
Well, I think that's part of it, but I mean, I could look at that and say, it says, take some cattle, they're probably going to need some food, maybe that's why, that's the case. But I do think God is testing them, because that's really what they were told. As long as you do my will, then I'm going to fight your battle for you. We're going to win this thing, if you will listen to what I'm saying. And that's why I was pointing out the idea of Jericho. I thought, if you're reading through this, you're going, boy, is this the way it's going to be? Are they going to be doing handsprings or something like that at the next battle because of what they did, and going around the city. Well, it wasn't always like that. Yes, Jane, go ahead.
Like we were saying earlier, it's about obedience, it's about their heart.
Yeah.
And God created them, so He knew what they needed, and He, like you said, sometimes they might have needed something, so He was giving them what they needed,
Yeah.
and emotionally what they needed as well. Oh, God's going to, like you said, God's going to take care of us, but it's all about their heart and obedience.
Yeah. And I think it's teaching us the lesson, that we have a tendency to say, oh, that can't be all that important. I mean, that's a very human sort of way of looking at it. We want to frame it in the way we look at things. And God doesn't see things that way. In fact, sometimes God is extremely strict, and sometimes He's not strict at all. Now that's that's a challenge, I mean, in terms of, we want Him to always react the same way. Now he certainly does. If you obey, everything's going to be fine. If you don't obey, something bad's going to happen. But for the most part, we have to understand that when He told Jericho, the people to march around Jericho, I mean, I suspect maybe some people might have been thinking, well, what are we doing this for? But that's what God said. Go ahead, Ian. Who did that?
I think we're kind of misstating what happened at Jericho. It wasn't that the Israelites couldn't take anything. It was that they were to dedicate everything to the Lord.
Yeah.
There's
Okay.
a big discrepancy in that. Because what did Achan do? Sin obviously was not listening to the Lord, but that's mine.
Yeah, and so the purpose, I think the importance also is the purpose. It was, you are to take it for the temple or for the tabernacle.
Precedent is being set because it's like the first fruits.
Yeah.
I led you in to conquer this first battle.
That may be a principle, yeah.
This is to dedicate to me these things that essentially were given to you by me.
Right.
And so Achan decided to keep that for himself, of course. So then we move on from that and we go on to a new battle.
Right.
Now I'm giving you these things to have.
Right. And I think, we pointed it out last week, that there is this significance of why would you take this, Achan, when look what God has been doing with you and for you for all these years when you were in the wilderness. And so you must learn to appreciate what God gives to you, what He provides for you, and not think that what I want is very significant. Okay, good point, Ian. Appreciate that. All right. So let's go to chapter 9, because this is what, it's entitled, who has a title on chapter 9? Okay, I love how the people who write the titles, you said yours said the treaty? Okay. The guile, yeah, that's good. The deception, that's the one I have, I think, of the New American Standard. Anybody have their hand up over here? Okay. So if you're following along and you think you're sort of in this pattern of the way things are supposed to be, this one doesn't fit the pattern. So it says, it came about when all the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and the lowland and on the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. One of these days we're going to have a contest and see who can say those fast. All 6 or 7 of them. We'll just have a time clock. Okay. So he said, it says, they heard about it, that they met together with one purpose, to fight with Joshua and with Israel. So the kings and the group somewhere around there, they've heard what others have heard. He's heard about Jericho. They've heard about Jericho. They heard about the Amorites when they were coming across the wilderness. And so they're thinking, we better get together so we can whoop these guys. So, but there's these guys, the inhabitants of Gibeon. If you go through, it's very interesting. If you just take your concordance and you look Gibeon or Gibeonites, and you follow specifically what kind of things that happened at that place. Because you get swimming in the names of all these towns and kingdoms and everything like that. But there were a lot of things that that were very interesting that happened. When Saul was involved in trying to win over the people with his strength, he went to the city of Gibeon and he slaughtered a whole bunch of people. And there's just a bunch of things. I mean, it was where the Joab and Abner fought, and there was 12 against 12, and then that was when there was David's people versus Saul's people, and that all happened in Gibeon. This is also I think it's a really significant one. It was where Solomon went when he went up to one of the high places, which was what? Were high places generally good? No, it was where they did paganistic things or worshiped idols. But they still used them, and that's another thing. It's always kind of confused me. I mean, didn't you guys learn this lesson, 300 years ago? You don't go to these places? And then, my answer to myself, even though I don't think it's totally fruitful, was that, well, they just figured, well, as long as we're using it for something good, not idols, it must be okay. But it was condemned awful a lot of times. So it was there where he asked God for wisdom. That was there at Gibeon. And so I think it's just one of those things that can be a really good exercise, because reading and going through all these kings and their kingdoms, you can kind of get lost in it, and you just think it's just somewhat meaningless. It's like being in your history class, and I hate these dates. Do we have to remember this or that? And there's just a lot of interesting things that happens there, because you'd think, well, Gibeon, that's just another one of those places. But it was a significant. It was also people from Gibeon came to help Nehemiah rebuild the walls too. And this was a number of years later. Yeah, go ahead, Micah.
I remember in Kings and Chronicles, it gives a different view as far as for Solomon, because the high places were condemned, but then the Lord responded to his prayer too.
Oh, he did, yeah.
So it makes me think straight out, we're saying, okay, they shouldn't be going there, right?
I'd say generally it was considered to be a place where you were showing you still hadn't gotten over idols.
Right, but then God doesn't see things the way we
Sure.
see it. So he probably has more compassion and mercy than we possibly can.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean he's always okay with it, but he comes down to
Yeah.
he loves us. He's gonna, he wants us to know
Right.
something. He can do it however he wants it.
Yeah, but I wouldn't think that what God's saying, don't worry about it, Solomon. Everything's going to be fine. God could have still been disappointed with Solomon, but see, our reaction is to say, well, if he's not supposed to be there, why would God answer his prayers? See, then we're starting to kind of add to things, but that's a good point. So, anyway, those are the kind of things that happened at Gibeon. But these were interesting people. They had heard about all this thing about we got to get together if we're going to be able to defeat these guys. Then in verse 3, let's see. Justin, could you read 3 through 6, please? Chapter 9.
But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho at Ai, they on their part acted with cunning and went and made ready provisions and took worn-out sacks for their donkeys and wineskins worn out and torn and mended, and with worn-out patched sandals on their feet and worn-out clothes, and all of their provisions were dry and crumbly. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, "We have come from a distant country. Now make a covenant with us." You want through 9?
No, that's good enough right there. We'll read a little bit farther down there. I mean, it took a lot of effort to pull this off. I mean, to look like we don't live here. Now, granted, these are mostly nomadic people, and so they had some area there, which was theirs. But I mean, they hear all about these people who've been winning a lot of battles. The other kings around said, we got to get together so we can take care of them. And these guys go, well, I don't know. We better come up with a better idea. Let's fake them out. Go ahead, Dan.
Do the Gibeonite people do the others, the Amorites, do they ask the Gibeonites to be with them as well?
That's what's implied later on, where it says they were angry with them because they didn't come with them.
Okay, so
Okay.
they probably
Yeah.
said, you're with us, and they said, you're
Sure, right, yeah. Okay, it's a reasonable conclusion, I think, yeah, okay. So, go ahead, continue, Justin. Start now at verse 7 and then go on down to verse 10.
But the men of Israel said to the Hivites, perhaps you live among us. Then how can we make a covenant with you? They said to Joshua, we are your servants. And Joshua said to them, who are you and where have you come from? They said to him, from a very distant country your servants have come because the name of the Lord your God. We have heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, and to Sihon the king of Heshbon, and to Og king of Bashan, and who lived in Ashtoreth.
Yeah, Rashtoreth, yeah. Again, when it says Hivites, the Hivites were people who lived in Gibeon. Right, so that's you can see in other passages where they did take up residence there. But anyway, it's interesting. It says the men of Israel said to the Hivites. I mean, this makes sense, doesn't it? Dan, read again. Read verse 7 for me again.
But the men of Israel said to the Hivites, perhaps you live among us, and how can we make a covenant with you?
Okay, so they're saying, now wait a minute. This is our land here. Wait, why do we need to make a covenant with you? This is our land. And so, they did come up with an answer for that, and they explained then, well, no, we're really from a faraway country, and we're just passing through. And I don't know, whenever I've read this, it's just kind of a funny story to me. It's just, it's certainly a serious side to it, but I mean, they're looking at these guys, and maybe some of them are starting to wonder about them, because they end up wondering more about them as they get to the end. But nevertheless, I mean, they're really trying to convince them, we're just hanging out around here. We're not from this area. So I'll tell you what, we'll be your servants. How's that work? And interestingly enough, Joshua says, that's good. Dana, you've got a strange look on your face.
that's not unusual. These guys are talking about how great God is,
Uh-huh.
and that's why they came, because we know your God did all these things
Right.
in Egypt. Can they not hear themselves talking?
Well, I suspect they can. I don't know if they're listening, but I think that what they're seeing here is they're not thinking again about God. I mean, the rule was, I'm talking about Joshua and the rest of the guys. Okay, that they were supposed to go in and take the land, and they were supposed to destroy the people who live in the land. And then look what happens. Hey, we got a chance to get some servants. We won't kill these people. And that is one of the striking things about this, because again, it puts us into this thing of, well, how come God ignored that? Well, Again, he doesn't make a big deal out of it. There are certain things that come out of it, but certain things are somewhat destructive to the people. But it's all because they just decided we need some servants. And what were they going to use them for? Chopping wood and getting the water. I mean, I guess you need people to do that. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I'm sure they would. Okay, so they just go along with it. And God doesn't really get that upset about it. So there we are we've got to make sure every time we're reading a story that we do have background understanding as to what's right and what's wrong. But for some reason or another, God didn't make a big deal out of this at the moment. Oh, sorry, Jessica. Right in the corner of my eye, I could see you. Go ahead.
Well, they didn't ask about it with him, so once they already made the promise, there wasn't anything going back on it.
Well, that's the way it turns out,
Yeah.
I mean, I wondered about that too.
And so, but he does use it as an opportunity, as we're going to see coming up.
Yeah.
He uses it as an opportunity to do some pretty devastating battles coming up, probably some of the most significant we're about to see.
Yeah, because those guys who decided to gang up on him.
Yep.
Yeah.
Kings think Gibeon's going to be a way to get to Joshua and Israel, but instead it becomes their undoing.
Okay, so let's go ahead and read on ahead. So they finally understand that they've been deceived. So James, would you read now verse 22 through verse 24?
You are cursed, and you shall never cease being slaves.
See, so there's a downside for them. Jessica, go ahead.
Both hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God. So they answered Joshua and said, because it was certainly told your servants that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you. Therefore we fear greatly for our lives because of you, and have done this thing.
Okay, so these are fairly knowledgeable people, aren't they? We know about the history, and it was interesting how some people knew about them, as they're getting there. And, like it was Jericho that was that way. I mean, they understood that these people were of great power. So, I mean, we knew about you. And we had these other brother and sister groups over here, other little tribes, and they're going to try to defeat you. And now we're smarter than that. We decided we'd dress up like poor people, and you would feel sorry for us, and you would give us jobs as servants. So that's what happens. Okay, James, keep on reading read 25 through the end of the chapter.
Now behold, we are in your hands. Do as it seems good and right in your sight to do to us. Thus he did to them, and delivered them from the hands of the sons of Israel, and they did not kill them. But Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day in the place which he would choose.
Okay, now, so if we're going to shove this into a pattern, we would expect God to say, wait a minute, you're supposed to kill those people. But he chooses not in that situation. So all I'm saying is that we can't shove God into a particular form the way, we all want to try to understand things. But we also have to read. And one of the things I'm trying to point out about this, as we bring it to a close, is that you really do learn things when you read through some of these accounts. I mean, you learn about God, you learn about people, you learn about how God looks at people. So it's not just another Old Testament story where people are, running one another through with spears. I mean, there's things to be learned here. And so that's the beauty. Go ahead, Noel.
Yeah, well, the thing is, when they made that treaty, they made it in front of all the people.
Yeah.
The priests co-signed it.
Sure.
So
I mean, they were in deep, weren't they?
They gave their word, their bond pretty much.
Oh, yeah, they were in on it, yeah. Yeah, that's true. And so, but I wouldn't say they couldn't have sort of recognized that what God has told us about what we're supposed to do makes that not valid. But, go ahead.
And I don't know if we can confirm this or not, but this might have been a preview of what God's plan was for the Gentiles, even though, he wanted a certain type of people, because
Yeah,
if you go like to Chronicles, it talks about when the temple was built that he asked for the foreigners. So this would
Yeah.
have been the people who wouldn't have been a part of the nation. It could have been
Yeah.
kind of a preview because, they're preparing the land for Christ.
well, I think you could say that, Micah. I think that, but we're kind of taking, one step at a time here. These people need to get the land. But obviously the Gentiles, as they weren't called that then, but, they're a part of what's going on almost all the time. And so it's important for us to do the best we can with trying to understand these things. And I think the more you read, the more you go through the general pattern of, how did I forget that? And I guess that's why God gave us brains that can learn things over and over again. So we will go ahead next time. We'll look at some of the takings there in 11 up to 13. So let's try to do 11 through 13. Yeah, that's 3. And because I want to at least give it a shot, as to get through all of Joshua. What's up, Dan? Now, the girl right over here, the young girl sitting over there behind Bob, she wrote me, it's you, Janine. I had the wrong chapters, or anyway, she goes, wait a minute, wasn't it supposed to be what, Janine? What'd you say, 10 through 12? Yeah, and you know what I told her? I changed my mind. And she took it nicely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess so. Okay, so, we need to do 10. I'm sorry. Because we've been talking about these kings. So we can't leave them hanging out there. So let's just go ahead, 10 through 13. All right? All right. Let's have a prayer. Hang on a second. Thanks, Father, for the blessing of the comfort of this building and how we can be here and draw to one another and learn from one another, and mostly learn from your word if we will allow ourselves to do so. Give us always the integrity to do the best we can in that regard. We know that through you we find forgiveness even when we do come up short, and we're also so thankful for that. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. I just wanted you to know. Yeah. I didn't call their names or anything.